Live. Okay, I'm here with George Gantz from spiralinquiry.com. We are now on episode number 3. Viewers will now, they're going to experience, just as we are experiencing, George and I in this space together. The viewers are also going to experience a more interactive approach to working with the text. I'm excited about this interaction, and I hope to see much more of this type of thing. Personally, I love being in the books. I love extracting the wisdom, thinking, pondering, and expanding my mind. So from that standpoint, I think how appropriate and suiting to this conversation is a quote at the beginning of Consilience by Sir Francis Bacon. And George, since you brought this one up, do you want to do the honor of uttering the immortal words of Mr. Sir Francis Bacon?
I'd love to, Daniel. I'm very excited about our conversation today, and just to preface about the book that we're talking about, Consilience by E.O. Wilson. It's a brilliant book. It's a wonderful book, and I'm really delighted that we're talking about it. So before the book actually begins, he includes this quote from Francis Bacon. Thus have I made it, as it were, a small globe of the intellectual world, as truly and faithfully as I could discover. And one of the reasons that struck me as I really like it is it captures the idea of the unification of knowledge, and something that I think all of us are big fans of. But I contrast that with another quote from Francis Bacon that I like, and I'll just read that. It's from one of his works, Colors. I can't even remember the title of it. I have it in a footnote somewhere. But this is the quote: "Let no man think that one can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or the book of God's works, but rather let men endeavor an endless progress or proficiency in both. Only let men beware that they apply both to charity and not to swelling." So there's the caution that we progress as far as we can, as long as we can, in both the understanding of the world and God's work, keeping in mind God's word, which Francis Bacon was a religious person. But then he cautions us to use the knowledge that we gain, not for swelling, not for our own importance, but to charity, which is sharing that and giving that knowledge to others. So I think that's a beautiful statement of the goal of humility, which we talked about in the first episode. So I think that was a great way for him to start the book, and a great way to kind of open the conversation on what we are all trying to achieve with this jumping together of knowledge, the consilience of the unity of all knowledge.
Yeah, I know. So something kind of perplexes me about the E.O. Wilson criticism in academia. So I'll kind of fill you in on basically the landscape of my perception of how E.O. Wilson is perceived in the community. Okay. Now I'm not active in the academic world by any stretch of the imagination. So I only bring in bits of information from what I hear in popular culture, and then I kind of gestalt it together, and I come up with a few questions. And so the questions that I come up with are: why is it that E.O. Wilson is in certain circles looked discredited or highly criticized about his messaging, and I want to be a little bit more clear on that. I think that this type of criticism comes from the likes of like a Steven Pinker kind of group. And so I know there was an article published, I think, by the Brockman Group, and they refer to themselves as the Reality Club, right? And I think there's a deep-seated fear or a warning that that is that emanates from this group that says, "Hey guys, let's just focus on the reality. Let's focus on empiricism. Let's not try and get too lofty in our goals of jumping together." And then it's kind of said with a little bit of sarcasm kind of thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I can see that. There are a lot of threads in the continuum. Lots of arguments in the continuum between those who believe the world is physical and only physical, and we know nothing about anything else. There is nothing else. And so they take kind of a hard line. I think many of the new atheists fall in that category. It's a hard line, and so anything else is nonsense. And then there are others on the extreme of believing in something, religious ideas, regardless of what empirical truth carries. And there's a broad range between there. And then there are many, I think, that believe that both the religious sentiments and approach to living a life or living a good life is all okay, and it's not inconsistent with the empirical truths that we find in science. And so I think there are many people, myself included, that believe that that both ways of viewing life and the world are true and correct. So there's no need for this contentious battle. But there are some on the scientific side that say, well, we don't talk about that stuff. And there are some on the scientific side that say we don't believe in that stuff. So, I think that's part of it. And I think E.O. Wilson gets some criticism from both sides because, he's an ardent supporter of science and believer in science and believer in the unity of science. But that ardency takes him a little bit down the road too far for some who are on the scientific end of things. And then on the other hand, if there are some things that he says about religion, which is like quite offensive. So to those who have a religious belief. So he's, I think it's great that he's come out with a book that gets criticism from both sides. I think it's an indication that he's probably, on a pretty good path.
A golden mean, so to speak. Right. But yeah, I mean, it would imply that it's a path of virtue. And I think that, you could frame it that way, that the unity of knowledge is a virtuous path, one that, that has a consilient coming together of people and ideas, however metaphysical. The idea is that we as a species have an ability to do and form abstract concepts and ideas. And so the way I frame it is that there's no way for me to test some of these ideas in a scientific method, right? I mean, other than if we test them from an outcome of human emotions and human activity, right? We can test them and we can implement these types of things, whether they have any direct one-on-one relationship with the universal laws of the of the universe, or in physics has yet to be established. But we sure as heck can pretend as if they do. And I mean, that's kind of the idea, is that we have this ability to form abstract thought. And so, where's the commonality of the abstractions, right?
Yeah, and I think part of the issue of that abstract thought is that it is abstract thought that has to get tested against experience. Otherwise, it's just fantasy. And so we've come to understand how to test the thoughts as they apply to the empirical world.
Mm-hmm.
That's what science does. We're not so good at understanding how we test the experiences that we have that don't fall into that category because they're outside of or beyond that which is accessible with empirical science. So one of the mistakes that I think some people make is just to take that stuff, that fuzzy stuff that we really can't figure out how to test the way we do scientific study, and just push it away, ignore it, deny it, pretend it doesn't exist. And E.O. Wilson has some of that flavor in his books. And I don't think that in the long run that's fruitful. I think it's cutting off some very significant and important parts of the human experience just by saying that, well, we can't really study those with empirical science, so we're not going to pay attention to them. The other approach that is also the case is to say that, well, science is getting better and better at examining the intricacies of how things come together, pulling it apart, looking at the interior. And the more and more we know about the interior, then we know more then we put it all back together again and we have the total picture. So that's kind of like the premise of the theory of everything. E.O. Wilson had that. As a matter of fact, in the first chapter, which we were studying for this conversation, he hits that issue pretty hard, and he talks about what he calls the Ionian enchantment. And he attributes that to, he attributed that phrase to the physicist and historian Gerald Holton. Yeah, it's on page 4. Yeah, page 4, the Ionian enchantment. Next page, let's see, down at the bottom of that page on the right. My book is a slightly different pagination. Yeah, the Ionian enchantment. And that next sentence is a pretty important one. It means a belief in the unity of the sciences, a conviction far deeper than a mere working proposition that the world is orderly and can be explained by a small number of natural laws. Now, that statement is not a scientific statement. It's a statement of belief. And one of my points is the whole enterprise of science is underpinned by this kind of belief. A belief in the ultimate ability of unifying science, getting a complete understanding of the physical world, and a belief that the world is comprehensible, that mathematical laws apply, that we can figure it all out. So that's a belief statement, and that's a belief statement that is not subject to the kind of proofs that a normal scientific statement or a mathematical statement are subject to. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he goes on in the chapter to kind of talk about his own personal relationship with religion. He grew up as an ardent Baptist and was very, very religious as an adolescent. And he goes to college, and then he starts doubting. And with that doubt came a rejection of some of the practices and principles that were part of the religious heritage he grew up with. But so it's at the same time, as a matter of fact, there's a good quote there. Let me see if I can find that quote. I love this one. More pious than the average teenager, I read the Bible cover to cover twice. But now at college, steroid driven into moods of adolescent rebellion, I chose to doubt, which I empathize with that because I was there in a way, that same kind of intensity of adolescent feelings. But he goes on, and by the way, this is on my page 6, probably to flip the page, and you might find it. In that paragraph that starts, still I had no desire to purge religious feelings. Third sentence, we're obliged by the deepest drives of the human spirit to make ourselves more than animated dust And we must have a story to tell about where we come from and why we are here. I agree with that 100%. That's part of the human experience, is try to explain those things. But then he goes on at the end of that paragraph, well, perhaps science is a continuation on new and better tested ground to attain the same end. If so, then in that sense, science is religion liberated and writ large. So he's now taking empirical science and moving it over as a master over the questions of where we came from and why we are here. And science can't do that. That's not science that's going to answer those questions. So I just love that tension between the beauty of truth in that sense of absolute finality of truth. Don't we all want to get there? Don't we love it? But that doesn't explain the love we have for it. It doesn't explain the belief that we have in the regularities of the natural world and the ability of math to discover it. It's interesting. One of the philosophers that I loved as I struggled with this issue in college was David Hume. And David Hume was kind of viewed as a consummate empiricist in terms of doubting the kinds of statements and things that we think about. But he also said that the regularities of nature aren't provable. They're something we observe, and we jump to the conclusion that those regularities of nature are permanent and enduring and comprehensible. But there's nothing that can prove that. So those are things that we have to take on faith. So to my mind, that's part of the whole enterprise of empirical science is built upon those articles of faith. And I think they're I think they're good ones. I think they're good because in my experience and the experience of everything that I've learned, that is a proper way to understand the empirical world, the physical world. We talked last time about the three worlds. Well, the physical world, the empirical world, this is the right way to try and understand that particular world.
Okay, I do. I like that. I like the sentence that says Einstein, the architect of grand unification in physics, was Ionian to the core. And I can hear that because I've listened to the audiobook quite frequently, and the narrator, I think his name is Paul Hogan. I can just he brings in the right inflection at the time, and I can hear him saying that to the core, right? He just emphasizes that. And I think if you look at the current situation of quantum physics, Einstein was, I think, in the minority, right? He was. It's ironic that I would say that he was Newtonian, but he's deterministic in terms of, that famous quote that God does not play dice. So he's trying to say that the way that we understand quantum physics with probabilistic states being in predicting it in two possible states both at the same time, kind of thing, right? This is not acceptable for him. This is the violation of that Ionian fundamental. What is the law of the universe that we're just not seeing? And I actually tend to agree with him in terms of how I've been able to disseminate, understand, and lattice my understanding of the way the world works. I tend to side with Einstein, and quite frankly, we could be in a science could be in a temporary position of understanding, related to the quantum world that doesn't fully or accurately describe the nature of the universe, right? It's, you have these directions they're like dendritic branches of knowledge that go in a particular direction, but there are dead ends. And this is the idea: science can retrace those steps, research, come back, and then go along a more definitive, solid, piece of predictable knowledge, I guess, or knowing. Right? Does that make sense, George?
Yeah, and it's I kind of take that point and say we have a situation in physics and cosmology where we don't seem to be able to explain those strange behaviors in the quantum world, and how the quantum physics and standard physics fit together. We don't have a theory that manages to capture all that. I think there's a belief that there is a theory that captures all that, but they may not be the case. We have these anomalies, these discontinuities in the theories, and I think it's interesting that even the greats Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow in that paper, I don't remember the date, a few years ago, basically concluded, and I have that quote somewhere, basically concluded that there is no theory-independent reality that we can find. That there is no, it's kind of another way of saying there is no absolute theory of everything that's going to work. We have theories that work for one piece over here. They don't work. We have theories for things that work over here, but the ability to put a grand theory that pulls them all together into a master theory of everything appears to be an illusion. So that's a threat to the Ionian concept of a grand unification, and then the other piece of it that I referred to earlier is the fact that where we're unable to grasp that grand theory of everything, maybe our definition of the truth is too narrow, too constrained in certain buckets of categories of ways of thinking about things, and that grand unification is going to require a different kind of expansion of the mind and of concept to be able to grasp the entirety of it. And I think, the mystics in most traditions will get that. It's the idea that this grand unification that we're looking for is not something that can happen in the head because the head has done these categories, but it's something that has to happen in the heart. And that's where we get back to the religious impulse, which even E.O. Wilson recognized.
Well, there was a philosopher that's done quite a few courses with the great courses, and I think he passed away in September of 2020. His name is Daniel N. Robinson, and he's a fantastic lecturer. So I've bought his books, a few of his books, listened to his lectures. The lectures are great because for somebody who's just getting into these kinds of concepts, or say, for example, studying Aristotle. He was an Aristotle scholar. His books are very, I guess, hard. They're a thicket. They're hard to understand, maybe for a layman, because they're an academic resource as well. But his lectures are really good. I guess for a layman audience to get a nice warm-up exercise into maybe something more complex, if that's where they want to go. And I remember with Daniel and Robinson, I think one of the conditions that he saw as problematic for our society is that we lack a direction or a teleology towards something in science, right? And so at this point, I could take this in several different directions, and I'll lay them out and try and make them kind of succinct. So we like, which way do we go with this kind of thought process? Okay, so there's that science may not have a goal-directed process in mind. Does this limit the ability for us to, as a society, agree on the directions that we want to move technology, move society in a particular way, right? So this is question number one. Question number two, where we could take this conversation is to say, I'm wondering what your thoughts would be if I now jump into the religious realm or group of thinking, and the outsider to that sort of question, somebody maybe in a new atheist sort of mindset, is going to say, well, this is all fine and dandy, George and Daniel, but what we're objecting to is the dogmatic acceptance and slippery slope that religion offers, the temptation from above, from the institutional structures that really, in their perception, provide a suffering, brainwashing, as they so to speak. And then there's a concept that what happens in the mind, the psychology that somebody above is watching me, like this pretend idea that there's a father figure in the universe that is. It's great to conceptualize it not as a father, but what is it about our propensity to pretend it's like a father, right? Like, I think it's like, is that going too far, right? Or does that just make it so that it's a heuristic that makes it easier for people to swallow the knowledge, swallow the wisdom? So that would be the second point. And then
Well,
on the
before
third,
you go further,
right? Okay, stay with two.
if you go on to the point, I'm going to lose the first two.
Okay.
Yeah, let's step back a bit. I guess one of the reasons I like that original Francis Bacon quote about humility is really important, because in the scientific enterprise, I think there is a high value in science for maintaining a core humility, with the understanding that any theory can be invalidated. So the theories that we postulate and that we put forward are really hypotheticals that we're hoping they're not going to be dismantled by some future future experiment that shows them to be wrong. And there's also a drive to kind of pull the pieces together, so we have a broader understanding and a bigger understanding. That is beautiful. That is wonderful. And I don't think there should be any conflict between that kind of aspiration for science and leaving room for bigger questions to be asked and answered in a different way. But I think particularly as scientists have struggled with the anomalies of quantum physics, relativity, and over on the mathematical side, you've got complexity theory, you've got undecidability, non-computability, all of these things that are just massive areas of difficulty and conundrums in terms of really, getting that complete answer to everything. The tendency has been to delve into areas that I would call metaphysical. And it's fine to be talking about metaphysics in the same way that we talk about theology, because now we're in areas that are not provable from an empirical or mathematical sense. They're in a broader area of discussion. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the aspects of science that are based upon certain concepts of faith or belief that have an impact on the way we do science. Yeah, humility is a good idea, and I love the joke. Was it, I don't know who originally made it, that science progresses one funeral at a time. You know, it's a realization that as human beings, scientists are subject to getting caught up in their own ideas, and things can become dogma. So humility is one of the key pieces of how we want to do science. And I think that same thing applies on the explorations that we undertake in metaphysics and theology. You know, how we discuss these things ought to be taken, you know, from a standpoint of humility. And then I think we can talk about these things without getting everybody, you know, bound up in their, you know, in their tribal positions as they, you know, deny, reject, or otherwise. And then there are plenty of things on a quasi-scientific side and also on a theological side or quasi-religious side that are just plain outright ridiculous. And those do not meet the test of what it means to have a more accurate characterization of the way the physical world works, or on the other side, an accurate presentation on the way human beings should be relating to each other and how they should be relating to the world, which comes from beliefs in certain religious and metaphysical principles. So that's a summary of, you know, kind of my aspirational goal for a Jumping Together, is to be able to have those discussions about the faith basis for science, and also the ways of testing the religious and metaphysical questions we have about how to live and how we look at the world, and what big grand narrative do we use to characterize the way that world works at that level. Does that make sense?
No, it totally does, and I do get that, and I think there's a, you know, I mean, I can tell that moving forward in, you know, we on a weekly basis, there's ways for us to just keep pushing this forward, keep revealing some of the underpinnings to this dialogue, right? So for instance, what I like about how you're framing this, George, is that you're very much a compatibilist when it comes to the two worldviews, and I think so. So we say to ourselves, we say, all right, well, what does that mean to the scientific community? It means that as a community, we need to make sure that we're not so adverse to the teachings of our literature and our stories, that we can simultaneously hold these two, suspend these two thoughts and these two ways of thinking, these two methods of living together, and try and see the commonality without giving up any science, but preserving some of the traditions and the historical teachings of our past. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and I think that you know, just like there have been dogmas in science and dogmas in religion, you know, we have to bring our very best minds and our experience to bear on how we evaluate those respective, call them hypotheses, or call them truth claims. You know, they're
Right.
truth claims in the empirical world. We want to be humble about making those claims, and we want to make sure they're valid. And then there are truth claims in the religious, metaphysical, theological world, and you know, we should be humble about those claims as well, and be able to look at how do we test those, how do we try those out, how do we confirm certain beliefs as being right and good and true beliefs, as opposed to other beliefs which are going to lead to conflict or failure, or you know, the inability of the human race to survive and thrive, because that's what evolution is all about. So there's a way of blending, finding the same truth in both the scientific say, the evolutionary field and in the religious field. Find the same truths on those two soils, and then we have a pretty good idea that maybe we're headed in the right direction.
Okay, so I had somebody in a interview situation a few weeks ago. And he's a Muslim fellow, and we've somehow lost contact. I'm not entirely sure why. In this world of COVID and sickness and pandemic, I can never be certain that someone's not not sick, and then the worst outcome for that as well. I can never be certain, especially if I don't hear from somebody. So I certainly hope that's not the case. But I came to a unique, I guess, framework that I was hoping that my Muslim friend would adopt in terms of his Muslim worldview, right? As a Muslim individual or person. And what I was trying to prompt him for is that it was an exercise on identity. So if his name is Dawood, he appeared on my YouTube channel, the Planksip YouTube channel. His name is Dawood, and the idea is that if Dawood didn't have that cultural attachment to his faith, if he imagined himself not running his thought process through those historical teachings and the wisdom that was handed down to him through through the word of his culture and his religion, his very being, his very existence would not be Dawood as he knows it. And so we say, okay, all right, Daniel, where are you going with this? Right? But there was a security to that where he paused and he thought about that for a while, and he said, yeah, and I like that identity. I want to maintain that identity. And from that standpoint, I can reject moving away from that my religion, because I don't want to be that person that wouldn't have this religion. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and I think that's part of what Wilson was talking about when he talked about who we are and why we're here. That's our identity. And then he makes the jump over to saying that if only our science gets good enough, science will be able to tell us that. Well, I don't buy that leap, because I don't think science can address those kinds of issues. And I think that sense of identity is part of who defines, who we are and why we're here. I mean, part of my identity is sitting here talking to you, Daniel, about these questions that are so compelling and so important, because, that's part of my identity. And I find it fully consistent with a Christian faith.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, not the kind of Christian faith you might hear about in some other areas, but I feel it's fully consistent with a Christian faith and fully consistent with a Jewish faith, even though that's not my tradition. And some of the great Muslim mystics, I don't know a lot about them, but I find some consistency. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite books was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which carries with it sort of a certain perspective, from the Islamic world, and I wouldn't call it religious, but it's got some of those deep thoughts that are in there. And I do think there's probably a commonality, what I know, that from the mystical traditions of any religion, about the struggle of dealing with the paradoxes that you and I were talking about. It's almost easier to grasp the difficulties of quantum physics if you're a theological or religious mystic, because part of that mindset is the understanding that fundamental to reality is a set of very confusing dualities that we have to try and overcome if we're going to live a life that's really fully integrated. So I think the mystics are traditions that we need to pay attention to, in all of those traditions. And we need to look for a little bit more mystical understanding in science itself, because we're dealing with these conundrums that we're having great difficulty figuring out. So there may be a way for these two very, very different, the mystical religious, traditions and concepts and the hardcore empirical side of science to learn something from each other.
Yeah, no, and so what I want to develop this a little bit further with my friend Dawood, because the idea was that when I challenged him, just more from a questioning standpoint, right? And I was trying to flush out something and say, if I mean, he believes that there's one God, right, and that God is Allah, and I maybe as many people on the other side of that coin, maybe with say atheistic or tendencies, we're going to say, well, then if there's only one God, then how can a Christian God be real, right? Are you negating a Christian God? And so it appears to me that he culturally, he draws a line, a limit, and he says, for me and for my culture, this is all that exists. Right. So for me to go into this accepting other religions does something detrimental to my culture. It contaminates my culture, and I'm somebody who, if I'm all in and I wholeheartedly believe this dogma, right? I mean, I want to use it just to illustrate the point, right? Not to agitate anybody, but if I really believe it this way, this is the best way for our culture to remain, to preserve our culture. Okay. Now, he's not a stupid man. So I can say, well, you realize that just over here, there's a man who has a belief that Jesus Christ is his savior. And he's like, yeah, I realize that. So on the same sort of token, you have a Christian group that say, wait a minute, I'm going to live life as if the embodiment of Jesus Christ as my best friend walking through life, universally accepting me and projecting all around me as the ideal form of a human being, is something that if I think about this in a heuristic standpoint every day of my life, and I realize that Jesus is with me, then it preserves not only that Christian culture, but a way of living that isolates you from some of the I guess like potential pitfalls that we may not know that we fall into, right? And so someone looks at that and says, this is the culture that I want to preserve. Right?
Yeah.
This is the framework which I want to preserve. So I will go into pretend world to do this. Right? So this is the area that I want to explore. I would like to say it's a pretend world, but we're all okay that it's a pretend world.
Right.
And
well, let me just sidetrack. Let me just sidetrack for a second, because as Hawking and Mlodinow said in that famous paper, even the scientific world is a pretend world. We don't have the immediate access to it, so we have to make it up. We have to make up theories that will explain these behaviors. So I'm being provocative here,
right,
because there are dogmas in many religious traditions that I do not accept. The dogma of exclusivity is one of them.
Okay.
And there are dogmas in science. I would point to, or call it scientism if you want to make a fine distinction, the dogma that the universe is ultimately random, and that there is no place in the physical world for some kind of selection process at work. That's sort of the basis for the many worlds, theory is, well, nobody's making any selections. So these random worlds are created in these quantum events. And, so we don't have any selection going on. Well, that's a dogma. And that's a dogma in science, from science, that I don't buy. And we started that conversation about how we look at something that seems to be random and yet it's very purposeful. That's one of these conundrums that I think some in the scientific community have kind of gone into a dogmatic way of thinking about these things rather than a useful and in a sense mystical way of thinking about them. Both can be true, and they can be true even though they appear to be contradictory. So this is part of a really difficult exercise to try and figure out how do you jump together? How do you leave your dogmas behind and bring with you the things that have value for those conversations?
I'm not too terribly stuck on the point that there's some dogmas in science, right? I mean, I kind of give that. I think maybe even scientists understand that to a certain degree. And the E.O. Wilson book is a perfect example about the Ionian enchantment, right? And then towards the end of chapter 1, I really think it's wonderful that he refers and returns back to the story of Daedalus and Icarus and flying too close to the sun and melting.
How does he finish that one? I just thought that was lovely because, yeah, let's see, where am I in the right one? Yeah, so he uses that model that you were talking about, the Daedalus and Icarus and flying too close to the sun. And he points out that traditionally that's used as an argument for prudence, right? Don't fly too high because the wax will melt and you'll fall down. And sometimes people have talked about that as the risk of technology. Don't push it too hard. And he ends by quoting Sir Arthur Eddington.
Yeah.
And
let's push it.
Well, hey, let's see how high we can fly before the sun melts the wax in our wings, which is. Is that really what you want to do?
He's agitating a little bit.
What do you want to do with nuclear weapons, or do you really want to test black holes to the point where one could conceivably consume the universe? I think that's pure fantasy, but it's where E.O. Wilson's hidden hubris pops out, and Sir Arthur Eddington's hidden hubris pops out, and for him, I think as you read the book, it's if you're looking closely, you can see that it's a bit of a blind spot.
Okay.
So this blind spot because he is so thrilled and excited by this concept of the unification. He's so caught up in that concept that he's blind to some of his own dogmas. And guess what, Daniel? We're all there. Yeah. We're all blind to the things that we don't see because we're caught up and we're really driving for this. And you can, so I think that's part of human nature is to become excited about things and maybe your belief structure gets ahead of, I want to say evidence, but I don't know if that's quite the right word. Your belief set can get ahead of where you want to be if you really step back, and again, this is sort of the truth has that great appeal. We feel like we're driving for the truth. When we feel like we've got the truth, we will grab hold of it and hang on to it. And then it becomes part of our tribal identity. And it may be quite wrong. And people hold on to wrong-headed beliefs about something in science or about something in religion for, they can hold on to it for many generations.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's really, really good. I was going to say something about the Icarus story. As you know, I return to Greek all the time, and when I see, if you're looking for narratives that actually unite academics, the humanities with science, there seems to be an acceptance with the Greek foundations as the birthplace of Western culture, there seems to be an acceptance from academia there. Whereas if I were to say something like the framework is Judeo-Christian, or something that's more religious, or from either from the Judeo Christian sort of origin, or actually from like the Muslim faith, Christianity, right? Those three Abrahamic religions. Science doesn't, or the educational institutions don't gravitate to those as, say, let's open the door and allow those in. But there seems to be a little bit of it. The door seems to be open for the Greek as something that's acceptable, and I'm in that camp as well, because I think that it's in at least two of the three, it predates them. Number one. Number two, the Jewish faith, right? The Judeo-Christian origins are implicitly bound to a Hellenizing force, right? They didn't develop in a vacuum, is what I'm trying to say, right? So I see a huge commonality with the definition and the dissemination of Greek origin stories. And so when I see a story like this about Daedalus, and talking about a civilization like Crete, and the warnings of prudence, and the conversations around these narratives, I think this. I mean, I love it. I get a certain. I love retelling the story. I love it when I hear cultural references to this. Right?
Yeah. So I have a comment about that, if you have, and that is, I think this is another piece that we need to be careful of, because our cultures also have blind spots and biases, and I think the feeling we have. I mean, I grew up as a little kid, reading the Greek stories or having the Greek stories read to me, so I have a great affection for that. I take a look at the Bhagavad Gita, or culture from from the Far East, and it's like, doesn't resonate. That's a cultural bias. And it's interesting in terms of brain research. I love this little piece I read recently, that our ability to recognize faces is just phenomenally powerful, but it is shaped when you are an infant. So if you grow up in a culture surrounded by a certain type of people, they look like you, and they're, and they have certain facial features, you become very, very, very attuned to those facial features. And when you grow up and you start meeting people from other parts of the world or other cultures, you can't tell the faces apart as easily. It takes a lot of work. And that is a cultural bias that we really aware of. And I think our Western tradition, as part of the Enlightenment and the rediscovery of Hellenic cultures and texts, fired up the imagination of the West. So I think that's partly a cultural bias. And do we really know if there weren't similarly great thinkers in India, in the Far East, in China? Or another example is the Muslim world was something that was much, much closer in terms of the evolution of those Hellenic ideas than we might want to think, because there was a period of time when the great libraries and the great knowledge that that we think about now as being Greek was moved into and moved through the Islamic world. And so it's hard to know exactly how much of that history has been rewritten 100 times, and do we really know that history exactly? So how much of it is just sort of the cultural comforts that we have and the biases that comes with that? And so here's another area where I recommend having some humility about the fact that, your Muslim friend may have the stories that came through that culture may resonate for him in a similar way, and they're very different. Um, and yet at the same time, I truly believe that all of those stories, whether they're Greek or Indian or Far Eastern origin or Northern Scandinavian, the origins of these stories are reflecting something very true about the human spirit, and therefore have something that we need to pay attention to. Does that
Mm.
make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I approach it from an understanding standpoint. So I came up with a concept called the hermeneutic meme. So there was an idea from Dawkins, and in fact, E.O. Wilson and I believe Charles Lumsden actually came up with a version of the meme, the accepted individual unit of culture, and they called it a culture gen. And so they're trying to really explore the idea of the replication of an individual unit of culture, right? And so, anyways, Wilson later just he kind of bows his head and says, "Yep, okay, I agree. It's it's accepted that this is actually a meme." And so I'm okay with that. But I developed this um, kind of like something like the meme, except for it was instead of an individual unit of culture, it was an individual unit of understanding. And the information that feeds into this, imagine like a circle or a black box, whatever, some sort of unit. And in mathematics, you could call it a variable, right? So the information comes into this, and it can be different perspectives coming into this one sort of variable. And from that, if you want to understand that individual unit, you have this pluralistic collection or aggregate of human understanding, right? And so I've been working on that, trying to develop that as a tool for thought, a tool for philosophical thought, as an individual unit of understanding. And so I'll use terms like pluralism, and not in a pejorative standpoint, but how do you put multiple perspectives into one individual unit of understanding, and where does the commonality come out, right? Not to you know not to eliminate other perspectives, but in terms of me understanding what your perspective is, can I listen to what George is saying, and can I fully understand what you're saying? And then, so how do I articulate that back? And so if you start to do that, imagine doing the exercise for all of human history, history and all of human understanding into one particular topic, one particular thought, right? One particular unit of understanding. What does that say about us as a species? And so, how many of those would be exact replications? How many of those would vary just slightly? That type of thinking is really, really fascinating to me.
And what's great about that, Daniel, is I see that as an area where we will find consilience in what might be called small c or small scale. E.O. Wilson and the conversation has been consilience, the big stuff, the jumping together of all knowledge. Well, now here you have an example of where there will be a unit of truth in a story told in a Hellenic culture, and a unit of truth told in the story of another culture, and a unit of truth perhaps told by a biologist because of what they've observed in the field. And they jump together. They tell the same
Yeah.
human truth. That is a beautiful image, and that's sort of that consilience where things can jump together and then you can recognize that this is something that has a universality to it. It's not just a core tenet or a unit of truth in the Muslim tradition, but it's echoed in this tradition and that tradition and other traditions, and even in the empirical science, it pops up. That tells me that we're onto something.
Yeah, I like the idea. You've helped me with something that it's not a big picture. It's an organically uh, drawn from smaller bits of information, and I think that's the idea. It's like what the cadence and the rhythm of our spoken word, our logos, right? That logical sequence. If I can understand what George is trying to say, and just repeat it back, repeat it back, repeat. Am I missing anything? Am I missing any nuance? Okay, and it's like that database of all on that point for everybody. How does that mix together, and where does it overlap, and how does it? That's interesting. I actually see it as a future field of development with big data. And I know that might be a little bit contentious for people that are against technology development, but I'm always pro technology. I just think there's a way to move it in a way that benefits us, as opposed to, I mean, this is just a question of ethics and liberating us from some of the confines of our current reality. But anyways, maybe for another day or another topic. I think that's really interesting. I wanted to end our almost actually we're right on an hour now, but I wanted to end it with something that might be contentious, I guess, but I'm trying to frame this, and it actually has to do with the Jewish state of Israel. Okay, and so you can tell that might be that might be a bit of an issue, right? So one of my favorite authors passed away in January of or February of 2020. His name was George Steiner, and I believe his position as a proud Jewish man, scarred still from all the horrors of World War II. His family escaped. He escaped as a young boy and was able to have a tremendous education throughout his life. And he was a polymath, and a polyglot. Tremendous respect for his abilities and his intellect. My concern is that as we entrench cultures, as we provide borders and boundaries for cultures to inhabit and defend, the wisdom that I see here is that it can be contentious for future generations because of the divisions and the imaginary lines that we build between cultures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I let me use the consilience analogy to talk about it. Consilience is the jumping together of things where you find unity. Well, what happens if you try to jump things together when there are firm boundaries?
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
so you lose the opportunity. I mean, one of the amazing things about the Jewish tradition is, thousands and thousands of years of diaspora and threads of thought and intellectual thought. As a matter of fact, I had a quote I was going to share from Maimonides, great Jewish scholar. Consequently, he who wishes to attain human perfection must therefore first study logic, next the various branches of mathematics in their proper order, then physics, and lastly, metaphysics. So Maimonides was a Jewish scholar that contributed so much to the ideas that have percolated through from Greece to Rome to the Muslim world through Europe, to us today, and that is without boundaries. So how do we encourage people to be able to live together without the boundaries on ideas, with an understanding of the boundaries of culture, but the ability to cross and understand each other across those boundaries of culture, and to try and find those areas where we can have that consilience and that growing together, where we all benefit from that. And firm boundaries, entrenchment. Entrenchment is a good word. I've used that before to talk about either biological systems or human systems. When they get entrenched, the value falls away. The value to humanity and human thriving, or ecological thriving in the biological sense, the value begins to fall away because of the entrenchment. You get stuck.
Yeah,
And if you're stuck,
the entrenchment works against it, but then there's also there's the concept from defenders of entrenchment that say that the melting pot of that they're scared of the melting pot and the identities not being maintained, and so having in the case of the state of Israel, it's finally like, well, we have an actual homeland that we can have a physical place to call our own, and this is accepted, and so that runs a problem. You say, well, if we move to a more inclusive, accepting type of culture, we'll lose that identity. And so there's a fear there. There's a deep-seated fear that it will actually disintegrate on the other side of your point as well.
So it's to address that is far beyond our ability in this conversation to address those political kinds of things. But I do have a sense that the world as a whole, the universe as a whole, and the human species as a whole goes through an evolutionary process, so that by working together and cooperating in the sharing of ideas, it doesn't need to obliterate identity, but it's a way of understanding how variety among those contributed to a greater truth, a better truth, and a better civilization in the long run.
And essentially, that's the face, that's the foundation, and the shape of the of George's faith. I get that. That's like your version of the Ionian enchantment, right? Is a fundamental belief in the goodness of humanity to come to common good and sort it in a common direction. I in that case, my mind kind of go and returns to Plato in that sort of sense. So the common good, right? So I think that's really interesting. One final thing that I want to bring up is, again, I'm going to throw something even more contentious here, is that in our ever sort of fragmented sorts of societies, at least that I see, and maybe it's just a continuation of an individualistic culture that runs a thread down North America, where you have Canada and the U.S. Even in social science, you have the United States that positions himself, well, in reality, is very much an individualistic culture. And I see a continuing push in Canada, and I think and also in the United States, to elevate the cultural appropriation of indigenous cultures. And so I wonder how to have an honest, equitable conversation without disagreement, right? I mean, I drive down a street in Vancouver and I see signs like, stop the occupation or something, like, let's get the Europeans out of our country kind of thing. And I don't, it's so hard to figure out how to deal with that. Right. And I think we've got a very barbarous, contentious, and inflamed society that's makes it very difficult to have some of these conversations in a fair and equitable way.
I think that deserves an entire hour or maybe an entire podcast series on its own, because we were talking about fundamentals and Consilience and E.O. Wilson and theories coming together, but the worldviews that we carry out of that exercise in trying to understand, how the world works, it becomes very different. I mean, the human race and the human species, and our, we have a long trajectory of how ideas developed and how cultures developed, and we need a way of looking at issues and pulling back to a much, much higher level. And I think the examples you present are ones that have deep history, that go back hundreds and even thousands of years. And that history has built certain trajectories. And to be able to talk about what makes sense in the current environment without the relevance of that ancient prior history, the deep time that feeds into it, is not fruitful. I think it needs to be given that kind of space, and also bring humility into it. We talked about that. Humility and compassion need to be brought into those conversations. But I think that's something that is a big one, and we ought to talk about that.
Well, I mean, and I know it's probably, I know it's way too big to to bring in as a quick footnote to this episode on Consilience, but we'll continue to build out and spend some time on the book. A future concept is that we could always bring a guest on and have a paused episode, bringing on a guest and having somebody, say, from an Indigenous community come in and a three-way conversation of consilience in action. That would be really interesting, and see if we can get to a commonality, not to solve anything, but as I alluded to before, have more of a three-way, have something manifest between the three of us that is understanding, right? And so this is one of the core fundamentals of moving forward, is to understand George's perspective, maybe a perspective of a guest, and then and really articulate those so that it's not nothing's missed in the fidelity of the trend and the transmission, right? So lots of cool stuff to explore, and I don't think we're going to run out of topics, George. I really don't. No, that's right. I have to point out that E.O. Wilson he's an amazing writer, and just going back through chapter 1 here, it's we'll move on to chapter 2 next week, but it's an amazing. He's an amazing writer. He captures something amazing. He continues to capture it not only in this book but in many other books. That's why he exists in my library as a favorite author of mine. But heck, that's also why he's been recognized as a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and he's a phenomenal scientist of our time. So I think we're very lucky to have someone like E.O. Wilson, and despite the bias, it's kind of unavoidable. We all have a bias that's revealed at times, and maybe that makes the conversation. That's the function of the conversation, that nobody speaks a pure, absolute truth. It's something that happens in a group dynamic.
I agree completely. Look forward to our next conversation, Daniel.
All right. Thanks, George.
Thank you.
Bye.